Welcome to PetroNoia, the podcast that cuts through the noise of the energy debate. Hosted by Dan Romito, this show takes complex energy issues, strips away the agendas, and delivers clear fact-based insights. Whether you're an industry expert or simply looking for a balanced perspective, PetroNoia brings clarity to the conversation. Each episode, Dan breaks down key topics, from U.S. energy independence to global policy impacts, focusing on the facts rather than the rhetoric, helping listeners make sense of the energy landscape. This is PetroNoia, where we separate fact from fiction to fuel-informed discussions.
Welcome to 2026. It's PetroNoia. I'm your host, Dan Romito. I am here with Andrejka Bernatova. I'm thrilled to have this guest. I was fortunate enough to meet her a long time ago because you still remain on Pickering Energy Partners advisory board. But just given her background and, we were actually talking about this 10 minutes ago, there's probably no one better equipped to discuss the pros and cons of the SPAC world, particularly as it relates to the IPO world, and especially with what you're doing in the energy and energy transition space. But one of the things that one of the reasons I really wanted to have you on the show is your background is fascinating. I love it. So within the boundaries of what your comfort zone is, can you just give sort of like the brief, and once again, brief can be 10, 15 minutes, I don't care, version of like how you got to become, and I love this too, like the title is a mouthful. It's founder, managing partner, chairman, and CEO of Dynamix.
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me, Dan, and Happy New Year to everybody. Started with a big bang. So exciting stuff going on, I guess, in the world. I just feel sorry for all the research analysts that, had the 2026 predictions and everything sort of has fallen apart very quickly after New Year's.
I don't know if that was a Freudian slip. Big bang is like an appropriate pun to like position how everything's been going on, but yeah.
But, you're right. My background is actually quite, I would say, different probably from a lot of people in the, energy and finance world, I would say. And I do come from the Czech Republic originally. Actually, my husband is from Venezuela. So we are the products of two, communist or socialist countries in two different continents and very different cultures. But I love my country. I was about, 15 years old, actually, on my own without my family. That was, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. And, it's a really interesting story because now, I'm almost 45 years old. I actually realized that what happened to me when I was...
That's not old.
I'm actually 29 according to biological age. So very, very exciting stuff there. That's a good reason to do a blood test, extensive blood test.
Love it.
But it's an interesting story because it just shows how a moment in life can have a really enormous impact on you. So I was walking home from school one day, I was 13, 14 probably, and I saw this poster advertising, study abroad in America. And just to give you a context, I grew up in a country where you couldn't really travel, right? The borders were closed. You couldn't get out of the Eastern Bloc. We couldn't go to Austria, which is literally 1 hour from my house. We couldn't go to Germany, that's 2 hours from my house. Yeah. Even Poland or Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, was just you have to have a special permit, at that time to go. And so, anyways, I saw this poster advertising study abroad in America, and there was like this Pamela Anderson style lady, running on the street, and then the Twin Towers, of New York City. And so I was like, wow, I really want to go there. And, and I realize now sort of almost 30 years actually since that time. Yeah, exactly 30 years actually since that time. That had just, that moment just completely changed my life. And there were many more moments like that in my life where I just saw something and I'm like, I want to do it. And I just did it. So came to the US, stayed with an amazing family in New Hampshire. They're still very, very close to me. They are my family. And, they were this example of this like American, anything is possible, borderline like naivete. But that's what the U.S. is about, right? Like you come here and you do what's impossible in any other place in the world, frankly. And so then I went to this amazing boarding school in Switzerland called Aiglon College. And the way I I got to Eglon, Dan, was, and this is just really, I think if I could name the most, um, characteristic that's most specific to me is just the hustle factor and never giving up. So if you want to
Yeah.
get into a, business discussion, business deal with me, and this is pretty well known about me personally. I just won't give up, right? I'll just keep
Yeah.
coming. And that's obviously what I do now. That's a really important piece of the skill set or values that you need to have, personality sets that you need to have. So I just wrote letters to the headmaster of that boarding school for about a year. And then, he responded politely, thank you very much for your interest.
Yeah.
We noted, and good luck with your life, essentially. And so I finally just called the guy 4 days before the start of the year, and I said, "Hey,
Uh-huh.
Mr. McDonald, do you have two choices? I will come and stay inside of the dorms, or I will come and stay outside of the dorms, but I am coming." And so, and fast forward, I'm now, very involved with the school, with the board of the school, etc. Right now, actually, I'm on my way to Davos, back to Switzerland in a week or so. So Switzerland is very close to my heart, and it was just an amazing experience. But I was a super poor person, right? Like, I mean, all my clothes was from secondhand shops in Czechoslovakia. All of a sudden, I was at this, the second most expensive school in the world. And then, then I went to Harvard, and that was, much easier than.
Just a little place called Harvard. Just that place.
It was sort of my safety school, actually. I wanted to go to Oxford, but at Oxford, I would have to, I couldn't finance it. I didn't have any money in Harvard. Obviously, they gave me a full ride, so I ended up going to Harvard. It was obviously an amazing experience. Made a lot of very valuable, friendships for life, and obviously there's incredible exposure. So that's my, personal journey, but I guess the lessons learned is just hustle factor and never giving up. And, the second piece I would say is just a ability to raise capital, right? I mean, like nobody has ever in my life paid for my credit card, paid for my phone bill, paid for my rent, for my, car. I mean, since I was 15, I had to pay for everything myself. And so the ability to raise money, which I had to, show sort of since I was 15, and just calling people, and what's the worst thing that can happen? Then
They say no.
Big deal. All right, well, I'm going to move on, So I think that's important.
It is.
Think about kids.
No, super. It is interesting perspective, like particularly nowadays, like we're the same age. And, my kids, I was actually just having this conversation with your publicist, like my oldest is 14. And unfortunately has like no concept of reality, right? Like just, or certainly economic reality. Do you, and then this is a little bit off topic, but you were a 15-year-old girl who left a communist country to come to America. And now you're an incredibly successful CEO, and there's a whole bunch of achievement in between there. Like your commentary on like the state of the state as it relates to what the U.S. is experiencing now, like how do you view that given sort of like your upbringing?
I mean, I became an American citizen after, like 25 years in this country, by the way. And it's crazy because I got all these scholarships, and then I, created jobs for American citizens to build American infrastructure. And I still, it still was so hard for me to get American citizenship, which was insane. So finally got it 25 years later, a couple of years ago, actually. I mean, every country, I think, goes through their ups and downs. What's really fascinating to me, Dan, is, when I go back to Central and Eastern Europe, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, it's fascinating to see, and you see it politically as well, by the way, how the countries that have, Venezuela is a good example, Cuba is a good example, any country that has gone through a socialist style regime, you tend to kind of swing the other direction, right? Because you don't want to come anywhere close to sort of that sort of setup. But it trickles down to society as well. So what I find fascinating, for example, in Central and Eastern Europe is, as I've been in this country for 30 years, and I go back to Europe, every summer or every year or so, I can really tell the difference where Europeans and Central and East Europeans specifically are just so entrepreneurial. I think they are very similar to like Texas approach, right? I don't want governments to help me. I had enough of you for, decades and decades, did not work. I'm going to
Yeah.
do this on my own. And, and in the US, obviously, it's getting a little bit in a direction of sometimes the success is being sort of, looked down upon almost, which is the
There's like a
crazy.
complacency, right? Like almost like complacency that's creating some sort of resentment, it seems.
It's, look, our approach so what I do with my kids, I have 3 kids, and literally I tell them my job is to make your life as difficult as possible. That is my job. And if you are successful ever in your life, it's because
Yeah.
we made, my husband and I made your life extremely challenging. I really do
Right.
believe, and you look at it, athletes, right? Or obviously,
Yeah.
people who are self-made,
Hmm.
multi-billionaires, etc. You have to go through pain. If you don't go through
Right.
pain, you are not going to have depth of character. And you saw, I mean, a lot of
Right.
people made fun of the Canadian Czech game, right? And how Canadians sort of crumbled because they go,
Yeah.
they're the best player, they're on the best teams, and then the first time they actually face, diverse, sort of opponents that are better than they
Hmm.
are, is when they're 17 or 18 and they don't know how to react to
Right.
that. It's too late.
Right.
You need to
Yeah.
fail at the age of 5 and 6 and 7 and consistently and bigger, and it's going to make you stronger. So I do think there is a no component of that hustle
Yeah.
factor that's really important, and we need to continue instilling. And the second piece is being successful, whatever it is, whether it's running a nonprofit, whether it's being the best teacher in your elementary school, whether it's being, Elon Musk, whatever it is, you shouldn't
Hmm.
be ashamed for that. Like, be the best
Right.
you can be. And so that's what, we are trying to instill in your kids. Just don't be mediocre. And so
Right.
mediocrity is, what I'm seeing sort of to cripple in complacency. And so if you are the homeless person, be the best homeless person you can be. I know it sounds crazy,
Yeah.
but anything you do, you can be the best at that.
I love it. Yeah. Like once again, we have, my kids are, the oldest, as I said, is 14, and he will be going to high school next year, and he plays football, and he did fairly well in his football, but he's like, no, I want to, play in high school. I'm like, well, then you need to hit the weight room. And so I was putting him through this. And my thing to him was like, I'm going to make your life a living hell. This is
Yeah.
going to suck. Because if you can put yourself through this, practice and football and all that stuff in high school will be a relative cakewalk. And he blew it off. And then of course he goes to mom a couple of times. He's like, and then now it's finally registering with him that like, look, dad is putting me through a living hell, because if I can get through this, everything else is going to be relatively easier. No, we are definitely aligned on this. Like even with the podcast stuff, I look at the first couple episodes that I did, I was like, what the hell was I doing? Like this is so bad. But you got to go through it, right? You have to go through that crap. Speaking of failing, you've had, and I'm going to shift topics a little bit. You have a very interesting comment. So for those who don't know, you are very involved in the SPAC world, and I want you to highlight that. But you have been quoted, and once again, correct me if I'm wrong here, and I'm paraphrasing. You have said SPACs don't work.
Mostly don't
So
work. Mostly don't work.
So SPACs don't work most of the time, but you love SPACs. Can you just bring us up to speed on why you have that perspective and what sort of orchestrated that perspective?
Yeah, so Dan, my 20 plus years right now of working background, it's a mix of finance, obviously investment banking, and investing. Large firms like Blackstone and Morgan Stanley and Mubadala, very Credit Suisse, very diverse. I would say set of firms from private equity to sovereign wealth funds to investment banks. The piece that I'm probably most proud of, and where I probably learned the most, honestly, in my career, is being an operator. And that's how you and I met, right? Back in the day.
Sure.
And so building and running different companies backed by private equity, taking them, public via IPO, having, strategic exits, etc., being backed by a number of different sponsors from large family offices to, private equity and infrastructure. So, it's been a long journey and a very diverse one, I think, from the experience perspective. And I think that affected my my current role in the SPAC universe now. And you're right. There is this. I publicly state that SPACs mostly don't work because they don't, and the reason is they are not. I compare SPACs then to leverage. If you use leverage for the wrong business, that's not cash flowing, not sustainable, it's volatile, etc., it's gonna tank the business. If you use it for the right business, obviously it's gonna supercharge it, take it into a totally new growth direction. So same as with SPACs. So if you use, I actually truly believe, and we've seen this, and this has been repeatedly the case. It's when SPAC is used for the right business that should be public in the first place, I actually believe it works better than an IPO. So
real quick, when you define "quote unquote" right, what is the right business? In my head, I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but like, can you expand upon what you consider or what constitutes as "quote unquote" right?
So number one, in an industry that has highly predictable true growth in the short and medium term, not just long term, right? So what we saw a lot in 2021, 2022 SPAC craze is all these new technologies and new companies, and it all was very exciting for somebody who is doing a second grade business project like my son was at that time.
The science fair.
It's really hard. Most of those companies are companies that should be going through multiple rounds of VC fundings and multiple rounds of PE fundings, and then maybe in decade consider being public. So there are a lot of I call it visionary style companies that went public that really didn't have a true business backbone until in 10 years. That's a very long time to be public before you actually can generate any sort of revenue or cash flow. Right. So real sustainable, true industry. Number two is, management teams that actually realize what it means being public. I mean, you obviously spend some time at NASDAQ, so you're well versed in, this is a very serious business. It is, in the US, it's regulated by the SEC. This is, you have to do things the right way. So you have to be prepared, one, to sort of work with investors and deliver to public investors what you promise. You can never fail on delivering what you promise to public investors. And, being well versed in what it takes from a back office perspective to run a public business. And so, and then the third thing, this is the most obvious, but that was probably the most forgotten in the last wave of SPACs. It needs to be a real business, having a commercial contract, having a real market right now, not in 5 years, not this TAM, imaginary stuff, but real market, real business, real commercial contracts, having real commercial counterparties and diversity of counterparties, not having one large company as your customer, and they're going to renege and your business crumbles, right? So actually evaluating the depth and the quality of customers or market that you are in.
What's also interesting, once again, there's just a lot on paper that is a funny contradiction, right? You have the SPACs, they don't work mostly, you've made it work, but also like your SPACs focus on the energy transition, which has its own respective controversies, because energy transition is typically, which is sort of incorrect, but the general perception is like it's tied to wind and solar. So like you have this energy transition, which people will argue it's not a transition. It's really a matter of semantics when you go down that road. And then you have the SPACs thing. So you've combined the energy world with the SPAC world, and out has come Dynamix. What have been sort of like, and you sort of alluded to like what makes it successful, but for your particular company, what has made it successful? Like, why has it been able to thrive in a world where the odds, particularly in both the SPAC, but certainly the energy transition world, are not necessarily in your favor?
Number one, Dan, so the way that, we think about SPACs as a team is you have to have the right team around you. So what that means, though, in the SPAC context is, we have a core team of 3 people now, myself, Nada Dalami, who is our CFO, and Philip Rajan, who is our SVP or now EVP actually of strategy. And these guys are, late 30s, early 40s, doers, executors, but most importantly, we are thinkers. It's really important to evaluate companies in the right manner, really dig in and do the work. Where you see a lot of SPACs don't do that. So that's number one is team. Number two is, and it's the truth, because I mean, there are a number of SPACs who do that. Probably, 10 or 15 SPACs do, a really good job repeatedly and have shown that that product works, again, in the right hands. So number one, team. Number two is how we structure our risk capital. So the initial money that actually funds the, SPAC going public and running of the SPAC. So we essentially invited risk capital investors that are sort of who is who in the universes where we are, searching for targets. So number one, obviously, energy. That's both oil and gas as well as renewables. Infrastructure. We have hyperscaler representatives now. Those are all, universes where we are searching with Dynamix. We are third SPAC that just went public at the end of October. But what's important about that group, Dan, is we have investors now, and probably from that group of investors that we have in risk capital, maybe 10 of them are actually very actively involved. So whether we look at a deal in oil and gas or in nuclear, whatever it may be, or specific sub areas, we invite those advisors and investors to actually help us with the due diligence process. And those are people also who have very multi-decade touch points and reputation, but also track record of consistent delivering returns to investors. That's critical because the two most important pieces of the SPAC process: one, due diligence, again, our internal team and extensive investors and advisors around us who actually do the work. We make them do the work. And the second piece is, making sure that you have the right balance sheet at the SPAC side. And so, we want to make sure that we have people around the table that help us raise capital and they can touch the sovereigns. Obviously, people who have extensive track record with public investors, track record with, large, ultra large family offices, for example. And so we've built that initial SPAC and the entire structure to cater to the day of the D-SPAC or the process of the D-SPAC. And so I think a lot of that is the sort of trick of, making the SPAC successful. So surrounding yourself by the right people and make them do the work. A lot of the times SPAC is sort of a retired CEO. He's sitting in the Bahamas and Aspen, and and
a lot of golf, lots of golf.
With a target. Like you go to Hustler, we look at hundreds of targets, right? But I would say if I could point to the one piece, Dan, that probably made it, is hopefully, pointed to some success that we've had in the past, is saying no to targets. You are gonna see a lot of exciting businesses and really exciting technologies and really teams that are really excited about what they are doing. Saying no, and that's really coming from our operator sort of background, mine and my team operating background. We've been we tell teams, management teams, we have sat in your seat. We know what it takes to build a business. We know what it is to, collect a below market salary or no salary for long periods of time to help build your business. I know somebody's going to come to you with another SPAC and tell you you're worth $1 billion. You're worth 50 million, and I'm not going to let you destroy your business on our watch. If you want to do it with somebody else, you're a free person. You can go and do it. But we just don't think that you are ready for this, public debut. So that's critical.
Yeah, the sort of the honesty, and when I say honesty, I'm not implying that there's fraud, but like honest with themselves in the sense that we've had several conversations at our own firm, and particularly even when I was at NASDAQ, very smart, very capable team, very impressive pedigrees. And you would say, well, tell me about the business. And they go through that. And it's like, well, what do you think it's worth? $500 million. Oh, amazing. Do you have clients? They're like, no. What's your revenue? Like, well, we don't have any revenue yet. It's like, well, what do you have? And they're like, this idea is amazing. And so I think there's this disconnect a lot of times, particularly amongst entrepreneurs where they get so excited and exuberance leads to like this. Yeah, one of the frustrations, it has evolved into a frustration of mine over the last 3 months in particular, because I'll still have conversations with very reputable, I mean, very intelligent investors, institutional investors. And when we bring up the notion of oil and gas, they are still hesitant to get back in, even though that the macro, in my opinion at least, completely supports, getting into the right stocks. And they're like, no, like I have friends, they will say something along the lines of, I have friends, or I had friends that were fired because of the shale boom. And it's like, I get it, but that was also almost 10 years ago. Like, maybe let's bygones be bygones. Also, to your point too, on the theme of adversity, like that sort of had to happen in the space because people learned their lesson. And now what is everyone beaten over the head with? Like this notion of capital discipline and not exhausting the balance sheet for some speculative play. Like, of course, there's some, cowboys that do that. But generally speaking, I would say 90%, probably more than that, 95% of the industry has learned their lesson. And, one of the other things that is, irritating to me is if we are going to compete in this AI economy, you need a healthy oil and gas base. And I think that narrative is losing steam a little bit, that we can get rid of, particularly natural gas. But how do you see like the conversations on, let's just say, more of the adjacencies like grid stability, battery storage, sort of all these sort of and all the above perspectives play out in your line of work?
Yeah, I mean, we have had the same stand institutionally and me personally for the past, 5 years since 2020. And that's, the fact that, energy is just one energy. And, you are going to just continue adding the renewable components, right? So obviously solar and wind, the largest scale components. And, we've made tremendous, changes and improvements in terms of the pricing and in those two industries, and you're adding batteries to it that have also seen tremendous improvement. That's a really important component in order to make renewables work, right? And the third component is, look, I mean, there are interesting technologies, and nuclear right now is in vogue, and geothermal is really interesting. I do think carbon capture is interesting long term as well. That will be added along the way, whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. But I think realistically, and I know you sent a few questions ahead of time, Dan. I mean, one of the questions was sort of Europe versus US and renewable, story. I think what's interesting about Europe is culturally, Europeans, my 70-year-old parents, they recycle, their house is like a bunker, air will not go in and out. It's super efficient. Right. They obviously the cars are much more efficient, smaller, much more efficient. Obviously, have a ton of hybrids.
Stick shift cars, like,
I know,
which is
yeah,
so foreign here.
That. I should, but full disclosure, I don't. So you are really, they have been ingrained in this. If I have a choice to recycle or not, I will recycle, right? I will be more efficient. And so just culturally, obviously US and really in the US, you have an abundance of very low cost energy in the form of oil and gas predominantly, or renewables. Texas obviously is a great example of that, where you're not necessarily faced with the cost effect of using fossil fuels that you have to import from other countries in the world. So I do think Europe has done better job culturally, sort of, and naturally they had to just be better at making daily choices that are just better. I think it's just better. Be a better person. Like, do you throw trash in the streets? No, you don't. Right? That's part of, like, who does that these days, right? And so the same way, it's like if I have a choice between hybrid and diesel, I'm going to go for hybrid. That's the choices they are making in Europe. And so even though it's a little more expensive, maybe hybrid, but I still will go for that choice, So anyways, long story short, I do think that oil and gas ultimately will price itself out, probably absent of any major improvements like we obviously see with the shale boom. So absent of any of those improvements, which are possible, right? Ultimately, energy is going to essentially work in a way where you're going to have this crossover where, renewables are just much cheaper and they are much more scalable, and the technology is there to sort of go over oil and gas. So it's not in our view, it's not just a nice to have, make yourself feel better about the world and just a better thing to do it to use renewables, but it's going to be ultimately it's cheaper to use renewables. I mean, obviously, one of the biggest stories of 2025, and it will probably continue going into 2026, is inventory depth, right? I mean, we're going to be drilling much more expensive inventory, and I know Dan Pickering has views on this, but in your shop, and I love listening to his comments, but ultimately, pricing in oil and gas will have to be higher because it's just much more costly to get it out of the ground. And US is a 25% producer of oil and gas globally. It is the biggest producer. So ultimately, everything will, move in the direction where U.S. oil and gas is going to move from a pricing perspective. And so we are a believer that obviously oil and gas will have its space over the next 5, 10 years, 15, however long it may be. I do think that we need to continue being very diligent, in terms of how we manage both oil and gas as well as renewables, but not burning capital that doesn't have to be burned, making sure that private equity sponsors or public boards are very diligent in asking questions, being really close to management teams and continuing to ask, questions on capital efficiency. Why are we using capital here or there and not, somewhere else? So I do think that we may want to kind of, continue doing that on the oil and gas side as well and not slip into the territory where we were in, a decade ago, as you mentioned.
Particularly in Europe, and I should know this, and I just don't know it to the extent that I'm familiar with in the United States. Do you think that there's competing interests between sort of the rise of the renewable space and sort of the need to compete with the hyperscaler economy? Like, I still go back and forth on, like, are they competing against another? Is it its best interest? Because to me, like, my opinion is natural gas will ultimately be the bridge to nuclear. Like, if you're going to have a hyperscale economy, you have to have nuclear in place, like, for a variety of different reasons. Now, obviously, France has that in place. Germany, it seems a little bit schizophrenic. Like, do they? Like, they probably could. But as it relates to European competitiveness with the hyperscalers, like, do you think that is in direct competition with the ability to implement more renewables into the energy mix there?
That's a good question. I honestly have not thought about that. I do think what's a bigger impact in Europe, Dan, is just the end consumer, middle class consumer cost of energy. I mean, it's enormous. It's multiples of in the US, right? So I think and obviously in Europe, you mostly have heating, in the US, you don't have a sort of, sort of critical energy needs as they have in most parts of Europe. So I would say that is probably a bigger issue. It's making sure that the energy cost is the biggest cost for Europeans of any cost, right? I mean, in the US, it's not the case. So I think that's more of an issue than sort of the hyperscaler competitiveness with renewables. Obviously, I think the second piece is just security of energy, right? With the intricacies of Russia and all of the geopolitical, the Ukraine war obviously continuing. I think I have not seen that scale of an impact in Europe really since Second World War. I mean, there's a real worry that the conflict will spread and it will have some, serious economic and energy consequences on Europe. It continues to be that way. I don't hear about it anymore here in the US, but it's a real issue. So I think those two are bigger than sort of hyperscaler competitiveness.
No, it's a really good point. You bring up a good issue too. Like, I mean, Europe, the EU in particular, and I'll throw UK in there. They I would share the sentiment on, like, the decarbonization thing, right? They're not that disconnected between EU and UK. But you have this Russia-Ukraine conflict, which, once again, what do you prioritize? Do you prioritize decarbonization, or do you prioritize getting an end to this war? Like, from your perspective, obviously you have one of the best perspectives to offer, given your background. Like, how do you think that dynamic plays out?
I think Europe has obviously a ton of issues right now, and they are sort of coming out in a more prominent way now with the current US administration. The immigration, obviously, policies had some serious impact and will continue to have some very serious impact on those countries. I think those socialist policies in terms of the social benefits and handouts to large portions of populations create a huge drag. So you have an aging population, local population on one side that will want to collect their retirement funds. It's a very different structure. It's pay as you go structure, as in Europe versus in the US. You're sort of saving for yourself when you retire at whatever age it may be. So you're facing kind of these I would say immigration plus local population plus socialist benefits and subsidies, etc., that are enormous. You're facing energy issues and resiliency issues. I do think the grid is in a better state, by the way, than it is in the US. So that's a good thing. So I do think that the renewable has gone on the a little bit on the sidelines, but I would say that the one component is renewables have already made such a I would say positive impact in Europe that it just like it's already set, right? Like it's already set, and it may be faster pace or slower pace, but I don't think you're going to go all the way back to hey, let's just go back to diesel cars everywhere, right? So I think the infrastructure around, vehicles, for example, is there more so than, in the US, right? Like my kids ask me, why don't you drive an EV? And I'm like, I just don't have the time. I don't have the time to thinking about where I'm going to charge it. I'm going
50-minute charge. Yeah.
I'd love to drive an EV, but I don't have the logistical time to deal with that. So I do think that there are, bigger things that they have right now on their hands in Europe than sort of worrying about the cleanest energy source.
I want to be mindful of time. And so I want to end with this question, and it's going to catch you off guard a little bit. If you had two or three forecasts, 2 to 3 guesses on what takes place in 2026, particularly as it relates to impacting your business, what is the Mrs. Bernatova's crystal ball say for what's going to play out in 26?
So, I think from an industry perspective, Dan, I think we will continue seeing obviously enormous growth of AI and everything that's related to that. But my forecast is that, we will likely see sort of differentiation. The companies, whether it's a power services company, whether it's a data center building company, but you will see sort of the ones you're going to start seeing failures in that space now as we are in this euphoria. So I think that the pragmatism will start in 2026. I do think that the public market, and specifically with the SPACs, I think there's gonna, it's gonna remain being strong. Obviously, interest rates coming down. I think the Venezuela thing is overall, obviously, from a personal perspective, is very positive. But I think overall, it has a positive impact in overall globally, right? It may create some instability because there are a lot of ties with a number of countries around the world to Venezuela that will have to sort of figure out different solutions or will be exposed. So I do think that there may be some volatility in the oil and gas prices as a consequence, but overall I think it's going to be very positive for the public market. But I do think the biggest trend, if I could point out to that, I think that you will see sort of differentiation, and you will see some failures of companies that had great valuations and great promises, but now they will have to start actually delivering and executing.
No, I agree with you on that front. It's going to be an interesting year. 25 was an interesting year. It flew by. I could talk to you for like 2 more hours. I want to thank you so much for the time. This was great. I love the story. I love what you guys are doing. I'm looking forward to having you on again in the not too distant future. So, Andrejka, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. This was awesome, and Happy New Year, everyone.
Appreciate that.